tell me about this idea that you have of curious versus furious when you're in dialogue with boys and men. Paint the picture of what it looks like in the room. What does a furious posture look like in a 17-year-old boy when masculinity gets put on the table? And what happens to that same kid when curiosity shows up instead?
Curious versus furious is something I've, borrowed from, Preston Morris and Tim Ross. I heard it and I absolutely fell in love with it. It's something that really applies itself to the work I do in across education. But for me, one of the sort of operating rules of the space. I'm putting that in inverted commas for listeners as well if you're not watching. But one of the rules for me is that it's a curious, not furious space. And often when we talk about masculinity, because it's so polarizing and at times it can feel quite demonizing to young people in their nervous systems, when you bring up ideas that they may believe in and you're kind of critiquing it or you're challenging it, that can be registered in their nervous system as, oh, this person hates my guts or they're attacking me. It's something that I have to now defend myself. So a furious response is maybe a defensive, well, no, that's right because, and that's wrong because, and I'm right in this context, or this idea is right because this person said it, and almost going down the regurgitation of the ideas and belief systems that they may be considering or that they may be in proximity to. Whereas a curious response is less about the judgment or the shame, and it's more about the help me to understand. So a curious posture in this conversation is that's a really interesting perspective that you're sharing about masculinity or about the current context of the world or about your attitudes relating to women. Help me to understand in your words why that's important to you. In your words, for me, is massively important. I call it a self-contextualizing invitation because often there's an assumption that if someone says something, they're this type of person, they've got, they watch this person, therefore they must follow this person, and they've got this political leaning, and they're likely to be in this context. We start doing this mental mapping of, I know exactly who you are in the space. The self-contextualizing invitation for me is, in your words, explain to me or help me to understand where you're coming from, because I'm curious how you've arrived at that conclusion. I'm judging you, I'm blaming you, I'm acknowledging that we've all got a process of arriving at some of the ideas that we have. We might not be in agreement right now, but I'm interested to kind of understand more about your working out in that process. Help me to understand. And what that does is diffuse any polarity of like, you're wrong, I'm right. And I'm with you. Even in the dysregulation that you might be feeling, even in the sort of confusion around what this conversation is bringing up for you, I'm with you and I'm curious and I'm giving you that space to arrive as you are. I might challenge that, but the respect, the value, the care is present. But often what I see in any sort of, conversations where there's potential for polarity is we let our own furiosity, I know it's not a word, but, we let our own sort of furiousness kind of step in, whether that's life experience, whether that's our own dysregulation, we project or we come in and say, well, no, that's wrong because, and I've had to work on that in the context of my own work in this space. And I've learned that being able to regulate before holding that space is so important for bringing that curious dialogue. Because sometimes the young people might come up and say, do you know what, Lewis? I'm not actually sure why I believe it. I've just heard it. And I'm like, again, that's really honest, but let's explore it. Like, you do feel quite passionate about it, or you've come across quite passionately about it. Let's dig in the soil. Are you just feeling like I'm attacking you? To be honest, yeah. Okay, so you feel like you're being judged right now. Yeah, it feels like I'm being judged in this space, but I'm not judging you. I'm just interested to know where you're coming from. Let's restart this again. What do you think about this thing that I brought up? Now that you know that I'm not judging you, now that we've really kind of acknowledged that this isn't a judgment space or me shaming you, what do you think? I'm not quite sure. That's fine. Come back to me next week and we can have this conversation again. Curiosity creates room for thinking, reflecting, and the potential to be challenged. That applies to me as the facilitator too. A young person in the space can come to me and be like, Lewis, sir, if it's in certain schools or that's the kind of language that they use, I don't quite agree with you on that. Sure. Help me to understand, Lewis, where you're coming from in that space. Of course, let's sit down and distill it together. For me right now, I'm coming at it from this perspective. I've lived in this space, I've lived in this context, this is what I've learned. And it creates a conversation where the potential for condemnation exists. And that, for me, is what the curious versus furious lens seeks to do. It's to acknowledge that we might be dysregulated, that we might not be on the same page, but hold in the recognition that I'm approaching you as the human being, not just the human. And as I'm approaching you as you are, where you're coming from, we can work with that data. If I'm making an assumption, I might be way off. And if I'm making an assumption on you that isn't accurate, you as a participant in this space and as a human being have the right to be like, no, that's not where it's coming from for me. So that's kind of why I like to lead with that curious discourse, and why I think a lot of young people over time in the space are so comfortable surfacing what they think, because they'll be challenged, but they also know that my respect and how I value them in that space doesn't change. I don't shame or hate them in that space, but I will challenge and curiously, compassionately critique if necessary. That's what that frame is for me.
Yeah, I think that's the way to go about it. And the common sentiment that I've read and heard from people who have watched these documentaries is like that's actually what we need to be capturing. Like instead of telling boys this is the messages you're getting and this is what you're believing, getting into the skills for how to dialogue with them to truly understand where they're coming from and get a true sense of how much they resonate, don't resonate with those people or just in general, right? I mean, there's obviously many sources of where young men are pulling the idea of what it means to be a man and what's acceptable. But what I appreciate about that and what you're sharing too, and it's so difficult, is the ability to put aside your own agenda. You spent years in secondary schools across the UK sitting with thousands of young men before you wrote the book, which we're excited to hear about, before the TEDx, before any of that. Tell me about a moment in one of those schoolrooms that stopped you cold and made you realize the work you thought you were doing wasn't actually the work you needed to be doing.
I was sharing this with someone at the time of recording this morning, and the conversation we were having was around being sort of data informed versus data reliant. So in the early stages of my career, I was very sort of data reliant insofar as what some of the data or some of the theory was sort of speaking to. I used as a sort of basis for a lot of my work, my session planning, etc. And I had built into one of my session flows a session on body image, body confidence, because that's what some of the data was saying. It was one of the most pressing issues for men and masculinity. So I thought, okay, let's embed that from a lived experience perspective. I could maybe align with that a little bit as well. So it was built into a lot of my early sessions. So this was around sort of early 2021 in terms of delivery for context. And so I was delivering these sessions. And when we got to the session on body confidence, body image, the sessions just bombed, man. Like there was not as much deep engagement. It was kind of like they were really respectful and really sort of trying to be engaged, but it kind of got to a point where I was kind of like, I named it and I was like, this isn't really hitting for you, is it? Like you're not tracking, you're not really following it. And it was like, to be honest, no, like we don't really think about this as much. I was like, got you, cool. So what do you want to talk about? And then what that did was kind of birthed one of my sort of driving forces, or I suppose one of my most commonly used sort of intervention styles in terms of delivery, which is the spew space, which is where, during some of my deliveries, there's a session dedicated in like a session flow of like 4 or 5. There's one session where it's just directly led by what young people want to talk about, what they want to surface, what's on their mind that I might have missed in my delivery or my sort of conception of it, like what's actually going on for you that I've missed, and then letting them land. Well, this is for me what I'm really experiencing right now, or I'm experiencing this, or I'm thinking about this. And the engagement not only went up, but their consistency throughout the sort of program, if you will, also followed, through that as well. And it's something that I've kept in to this day. But, they were so blessed and they were so respectful about it. Like, it's just not really what we talk about, what we're really interested in right now. It would probably be something that you discuss more in this current context of kind of like looks, max, and culture, etc. But at that point in 2021, it was kind of like, this is not on our radar right now. We want to talk about something else, something a little bit more interesting or more like in our lives than what you're bringing in. So that was a moment that stopped me, and it forced me as a facilitator to be like, well, do I go and sort of dig my heels in and go, no, we're going to talk about this. I think it's really important. Or do I just go, no, no, you're co-curating this space with me. If it's not working for you, let's work on something that brings you back into the room truthfully, authentically, congruently. And it really changed my delivery moving forwards, man. So yeah, that's one of the moments that sticks out for me.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. As you were, just really reminded me from the work that I do as a therapist. I hear a lot of conversation around the gap between a parent-child relationship and the factors that contribute to that. And it's very similar. I think as a parent, you have certain things you obviously want to talk to your kids about that you feel like you need to. And as a parent, you're certainly not only entitled to that, you should. I mean, that's your role. But there seems to be, let's say, an over reliance on that projection that you also initially had that I think creates that disconnect where the kid says, listen, I kind of get it, good grades, find good relationships, friendships, romantic, stay out of trouble more or less. Like everyone kind of knows the gist, right? But when it comes down to what they really want to talk about, it's very shocking how rare it is, I would say, to really lean an ear into asking a kid in particular like you did, what they wanna talk about. And what I get from that is the humility that you had to be wrong. Usually, when we have authority, as much as we say we don't like power, it's hard to give it up, right? It's hard to say, "Oh, wow, I spent all this time on this lesson, and I think this is important, and this is what the data says." But you didn't double down on that. You actually took the low road and said, "I'm gonna give it ear." But then in doing that, I think it sounds like the kids really felt not only empowered, but dignified, like, "Oh, he actually truly wants to hear what I have to say." And when that sense that someone really cares, like, for the sake of caring kicks in, to your point, I mean, I think the engagement just naturally takes care of itself.
It's something I get consistently in my work is that, and I explore this reflection with the young people as well. It's good. It feels like you actually listen in the space. Like it feels like you're not here just to kind of like do the work with us, but you're actually interested and invested in what we have to say. And I'm often really honest and was like, yeah, but I wasn't always this way. I often thought it was this particular way was best, etc. But I learned just as much from the young people I work alongside and facilitate space for as much as hopefully they take from me. And it's a beautiful kind of dynamic to explore and examine curiously together for sure.
I'm curious your thoughts on this. So there's been a few shows in the last few years, one being Adolescence, the most recent being Inside the Manosphere, which is a bit more of a true documentary. How big the gap is between what media, what adults are exposing or stating are really gripping messages that young men have, and then versus the reality that in the trenches messages and really things that they want to talk about. And the reason I ask this just to preface is, I work with several young men in that kind of like 14 to 18, 19 range. And first of all, some of them have never heard of Andrew Tate or some of the people in the documentary, right? But two, I don't find they're really vying for the classic like get rich and get ripped and kind of treat women in a toxic way. I find there's like a genuine desire to just learn how to be a man, but in a considerate and loving manner, but really just to have connection. So before I get into my thoughts, I'm curious what you think about.
I think it's been a really interesting time over the past couple of years, specifically in my work in here in the UK with some of the series, adolescents, and also the documentary. It opens up conversations in a range of different spaces. And for some people watching those shows, it's the first time they're exposed to maybe some of those ideas, some of those people, some of those thought processes. And it's super dysregulating, it's super confusing, and there's often a lot of guilt and shame that comes with that. Of like, how could I not know? Is this what I've been allowed to occur in this space? And what I will say is, well, some of those kind of behavioral expressions and ideas that you may see across those series may be present in educational spaces or in classroom contexts within young boys or young men in the context of education. What I also observe over the years doing this work is that there is, as you've kind of touched on, a genuine curiosity to explore some of those ideas. Like there's often this construction at the minute that, mentioning things like feminism, patriarchy in the context of boys, it results in classrooms getting kicked up and things being thrown about. And there's like a massive, like, reaction. Boys are coming into the space with those questions and those reflections in the sense of, at least from my experience, like I'm hearing about this, but I'm hearing about it from this person. What's your thoughts on it? Because I don't really know how to approach it. There's a curiosity to I'm hearing it from this lens and it resonates with me at this point. But what do you think about it? Because I can't really speak about this, or it's not I can't speak about this. I don't know how to go about speaking about this elsewhere. So there's kind of a reality to what it's discussing. Some young people do share those ideas and have those sentiments, but when you really explore the soil of the heart posture, a lot of the time what happens is when you ask somebody to like, where have you heard this from? Or like, have you considered it from this perspective? Or why is that so important to you? Because it feels like it is important to you. When you really pose the reflective questions, often it's a sense of, well, I kind of see it online and I think it's what people want me to do. Or I think it's kind of like this, we're in this rage bait culture now a little bit where it's kind of like it's provocative and it kind of gets that reaction. I don't know if I really believe in it, but I know that I kind of share some of those ideas. And it's like, okay, that's the first time you're being honest. And that's really important because you might not know if to you that might just be a passing comment or a passing reflection, but some of your classmates, some of your teachers, some of your peers, maybe even to people in your friendship group, that can be really harmful or dysregulating. And it's the first time that they kind of piece together, wait, what I'm experiencing and what I'm processing isn't just from my lens, it's for the people in and around me too, but also that curiosity to be like, I haven't really considered that before. I often use this analogy with young people because sometimes there's defensiveness. No, that's not what it is, and you're sort of hating on me in this sense, and this is like you're just hating men in the space, and I don't mean it like that. It's not my intention. To which you sit with that dysregulation. I don't avoid it. I don't go, okay, it's fine. I don't mean to offend you. I sit with that uncomfortability of help me to understand where you're coming from. And often what lands with these young people when that is the reaction is I ask a really maybe an interesting question or question like, why is those asking that? I often ask them, do you know what happens when you mix Coke and Mentos together? And they go, of course. Why are you asking that? It's a stupid question. I'm like, well, remember the first time that you saw that happen, right? You look at the Mentos and you go, how's that small thing going to cause any problem to this Coke, right? But sometimes the small and insignificant in the right context causes the biggest reactions. And for you, it's small and insignificant, but to some people, to a lot of people, that can cause those reactions. You're seeing the reaction and going, but it's only a Mentos. But to other people, that's causing those reactions. And it places young people in that space of like, whoa, what I think and how I'm experiencing and what I'm contacting has not just personal ramifications, but cultural ones too. And it's that moment where they sit in and go, actually, I need to think about myself from not just as the human being, but also the human doing. What am I co-signing in this space? What am I engaging with? How am I showing up in those spaces? And with that comes that curiosity. With that comes that potential dysregulation, but they stay consistent in that space. Well, help me to understand this. I've got this question. And I think that's something that maybe provide some hope, perhaps, to the listeners. Listen, I see a lot of presentations in this work. I see a lot of really harmful, problematic ideas. But one thing I can say is that the consistency of young people to show up in those spaces and dig in the soil is there and is present and is something that is possibly, for me, one of the most gratifying things of the work that I do, because I believe that every young person that I work with is reachable. I don't like this frame of like young people, hard to reach. It's maybe they're hard to reach in the maybe the tools that we might use, but every young person can be met where they are, but also challenged as they are with that respect, that humility, that curiosity. And I think that for me is kind of the context that we're in now that I want to speak to more because it's something that I feel is maybe missing a little bit in the conversation.
I agree, and I like that analogy a lot, and I think it could sadly apply to a lot of adults, but I think that notion of I guess dismissive language, right? When we put the word just, it essentially is trying to minimize the realistic impact or reality of whatever we're about to say, right? And sometimes we don't even mean to say it, but sometimes you might have shame in a job. Oh, I just worked this kind of job, right? Or in this case, it was just a comment that was made. And I think that analogy is so good because it really hones in the responsibility to the present moment. Because I think so much of these conversations, including these documentaries, kind of the disconnect I have with them, let's say, is it feels so big, right? Like it feels like they're trying to get boys to believe or not believe a message of getting rich, getting ripped, all that stuff. When actually, if we distill that message down, it comes in a moment where someone makes fun of their arm shape and says, "You're not big enough," right? Or they pass a girl in the hallway and their buddy makes a comment and they stay silent. And those are the little mentos where it sounds like your work is really effectively, specifically targeting, saying, hey, those are the moments where you either learn a lesson or apply it. It's not these huge things. It's almost like in school, you go through school, right? But every day it's the fact that you showed up and you learned something every single day that got you to finish school. But you don't live life on this like grand scale of like, I'm educated as a person. And I think in the same way, it sounds like that's what you're helping distill down to a guy is like, hey, is actually these huge messages. Let's just kind of put those aside for now. What came up for you? Like, why didn't you say something when your friend made that, rude comment about a girl or tried to show you a picture of something inappropriate, right? Oh, well, I don't know. I'm scared of getting bullied. I'm scared of getting rejected, or I didn't want to appear this way. And to your point, instead of judging, saying, okay, why is that? Why is that so difficult? Like, why does that feel like you can't do that? And essentially walking them through the value, which is just, again, good for any human to know as you mature, which is how do you value the virtues instead of the vices? And essentially, as you get older, start replacing those vices for the virtues. And while the vices are certainly compelling and those less than ideal character traits get us certain things in life, it's saying how can we take the road less traveled, let's say, and really teach these, especially boys, these messages to say, like, what does it look like to act out in these small moments, mature, whole, loving, caring masculinity? And then that actually answers that macro question of how do I mature? How do I be a man?
Yeah, it's I think for me, what I learned going back to the first question as well is that I noticed really early on in my work the value of modeling what I sought in the space. You know, some the most potent teaching moments isn't necessarily what I vocalize and say, well, this is this and this is how it shows up. Most young people that I've worked with that come and like bump into me a few years later, they don't necessarily remember what I said word for word verbatim, but what they do recall is I remember that you were always really open with some of your own mistakes or your own kind of learnings, and you weren't afraid to get things. For example, like they remembered what was modeled, which then applied was easily applicable into their context. What they see, they can then sort of, oh, I can see that that works, or I'll make that my own. And I think I learned that quite early on, maybe because I started quite young in the work and I had to kind of find a way in to kind of connect, but also produce that dynamic. But for me, it was one of the most potent opportunities to really sort of connect with young people is I'm modeling what I'm seeking. I can talk about what's needed, but if I can show it and I can demonstrate it, then it can be used as a way of that's how, or I like that and I'm going to modify that. Or this is more like it's visible. You can feel it, and that for me is so important in the work too.
Yeah, it's so brilliant. And something you're actually touching on in therapy work is the idea of mapping. So when you're younger, you essentially look to your caregivers and those closest around you to actually show you how to do certain things. And like on a real basic level, this is like how do you brush your teeth, right? Someone has to teach you. But on a more complex level, it's well, how do you talk to someone? How do you regulate emotions? How do you express certain feelings that you're having and communicate, right? And those caregivers are meant to be the ones that exemplify that. Now, the issue for a lot of us is either we don't have the caregiver or the caregiver shows us a bad example of that. Well, because of the biology, we're actually still mapping that unhealthy model subconsciously. And then we grow up and we start doing maladaptive or dysfunctional behaviors. And one of two things happen. We either, usually, the most common one, feel shame like, what's wrong with me? Like, why am I just not getting this right? Why can't I just understand this concept? Or we feel like it's a threat that we're wrong in that. And we're actually not willing to admit we need to learn to do it right for whatever reason. And so we double down on, and this is kind of where the manosphere comes in, right? We double down on the unhealthy way of doing it because the feeling of getting it right is so powerful that even if we know deep down that it's wrong, that feeling will still drive us to maintain the consistency of that behavior, right? And what you're getting at is that if we can reintroduce or remodel healthier ways of doing things, and not through the rational westernized, like you were saying, I'm going to verbally tell you a life lesson and you're going to conceptually get it, and then you're going to sit down and we're going to test you on your memory of that. And, it's not that, but it's an experiential saying, oh, you know what, I was watching Lewis talk to that other teacher, or when he shared and level set about something he struggled with, the way he shared that, and just they're paying attention, and kids are just really a lot smarter than we want to give them credit for. So anyways, what you're getting at is super brilliant, and I would just encourage you to keep doing that, because that modeling is so powerful. And one way to see it is most of the guys, especially that coming into working with you or around you, either have no models or bad models. And so you might be the only healthy male role model in their life that's introducing any healthy, compassionate, and loving example of what it means to be a man. And I think a lot of us in this work kind of forget that, because it's easy to think, oh, well, like there's a lot of people in this space and I have a lot of people around me that are healthy. But we got to realize, for the average man, and especially young man, actually that's really a diamond in the rough. I'm curious how you do regulate, you mentioned before coming into those conversations, because I think for a lot of us listening, I think, oh yeah, conceptually, like I get you. And then I'm like, man, but experientially in that moment, I can already feel my ego wanting to impulsively come up. So curious, any tips for anyone listening, like how can we stay grounded? How can we stay open and curious? How can we model the healthy way of really dialoguing and desire to understand?
For me, it's difficult for me at times as well. Like I'm a human being as much as a human doing, right? And I think it's at times it's like, whoa, that's really hit me like in a way I wasn't expecting. But I think for me, how I like to regulate, and maybe if people will like see some of the content what I often hear in my work is we see some of the stuff that you talk about and how you talk about it, we expect you to come in like all guns blazing, like just absolutely flaming these kids for X, Y, and Z. And it's like, remember, you're on my platform, so they're my ideas, right? That it's my perspective. I'm sharing. I'm bringing it in. For me, as a facilitator in a space working with young people, my job is not to tell young people what to think. It is to show them how to think, in my opinion. So in this space, my ideas, my frames aside, part of my regulation is recognizing I've got to be aware of myself enough to realize that I might sway a discussion or shut down somebody sharing what they think by not being able to check myself in terms of how I react, what I bring into the space, and how I show up. So my regulation tool is, I was talking to somebody about this the other day, professionals that I was sort of holding space for, about to embark on this work. For me, one of the things I like to do, and I'm not always 100% accurate at this, but I like to have in my mind a sort of checklist or a list of things that might dysregulate me, or I feel like are likely to dysregulate me before I even step into the room. So I can work on that before I step in. I'm not caught off guard with anything. This conversation right now is really like, it's activating for me, or this point, or these ideas that I'm seeing, this influencer, this influence mention is quite activating for me. If I can name that before I step into a room, I can calibrate my nervous system better to be able to sit with what might come up. So my pre-work is around what might come up today, not just that same template for every session. How am I feeling right now? Am I rested? Am I good? Am I over caffeinated? I'm a type 1 diabetic. Are my blood sugars good? Because that can impact and influence a lot of things, right? All of these things, recognizing that even though I'm a facilitator to these young people, I'm an active participant in the space. Even if I'm trying not to come across in that way, they will read me. I say this all the time, young people are some of the most finely tuned BS detectors on planet Earth. They know when something isn't 100% truthful to you, or you're playing a bit of a role. It's almost like they can, that's not right. You're not being truthful, right? So it's one of those things for me. How do I get myself into that space of, I go into a room recognizing what might bring me up into activation, but also reminding myself my job in this space. And genuinely, one of the best feedbacks I've ever received from any group of young people I've worked with was given to me about 8 months ago. And it was an anonymous piece of feedback. And it came to me, so the school that I was working with shared with me. I said, you might want to see this. And it was like, I like that Lewis taught me how to think, not what to think. And I think that for me is one of the most important things. We cannot always be on the same wavelength as young people that we work with, but we must also be aware of how our own influences or our own ideas may produce this social desirability bias where that young person in their own stress might start trying to fawn to sort of in their own sort of dysregulation. I'll say what needs to be said just to get through the session because it's uncomfortable. I don't want to create that space. So for me, I might challenge, I might critique, I might, spotlight ideas and behaviors that I think need to be explored and examined because they've got potential to cause harm, but I will do so in a way where they recognize that we're in this together. But for me to do that, I've got to take stock of what might activate me today and then what might inflame me in those particular spaces and how can I work on that before I step into the room. That's my responsibility as a facilitator. That's not the young people in the space. That's my responsibility to make sure that when I step in, those young people in that space are not only getting the most attuned version of me, but they're getting the most regulated version of me because I'm there to serve in that space. I'm there to help them, and I can't help them without tending to myself first. So that's kind of how I approach it in the work, for lack of a better term.
In DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, we call it pre-existing vulnerability factors. So what are the things that have essentially primed you to be vulnerable to experiencing certain emotions? And I think what you're getting at is so wise, which is know yourself and know, okay, I know when I've had this kind of conversation or this language comes up or someone expresses this kind of emotion, this tends to happen within me. And then the other thing you've mentioned several times, which I want to touch on, is challenge, and I think there's this misconception that men either like only want challenge and need to be proven wrong, or that they are completely apprehensive to it because they equate that with judgment or not understanding. But I think what you're getting at is a deeper, truer, again, more wise way, which is I will always make space to hear you out and to validate your experience of something. It doesn't mean I'm going to enable. It doesn't mean I'm just going to, placate to whatever. It also doesn't mean I'm going to completely dismiss it and just essentially, like most of us do, only let someone talk so that they can be justified in them sharing. We don't really we essentially wait for someone to finish talking so we can talk instead of genuinely being present to those words. And then based on what someone's saying, then we respond. And I'm curious when it comes to that challenge, how you toe the line of essentially when you may read that a young man is too resistant, which, in my estimation, resistance means not ready. Not saying they shouldn't be ready, but it just means psychologically, hey, I'm not ready. When to push against that resistance because you feel like, man, I feel like the breakthrough, that insight that they're going to have is right on the other side. They're open to the challenge. They want to be. And when it might just feel like too much. And in that moment, as much as you can challenge and disagree, you just need to hold space for them to feel validated.
So there's two ways I do it. So if I feel like there's something that needs to be challenged and there is that resistance, and I love that frame is resistance is not ready because often it is in whatever context it is, it's that I'm not ready to hear that or I don't feel like I'm able to hear that. So I make this separation. I'm challenging the ideas you have, not the person you are. So the idea is taken out. We're looking at the idea. You as the person in this space, that's not a self. I'm not attacking self-worth. I'm not attacking, the human being. I'm looking at the idea because ideas are a little bit like pick and mix. And I use that analogy. It's like, you can pick them up. You've got your favorite ones and you always go to familiar ones. But sometimes you can't pick and mix out. That's why we kind of frame it in that way. And so I'm challenging the ideas you have, not the person that you are or who I think you are. So they recognize that the challenge isn't, I feel like you are X person, this type of masculinity. It's, I'm looking at that idea because I care too much about you for you to think that that frame is just, I'm just going to let that exist where it is. I can approach it that way. But if it's longer series of work, which often it can be, it will be something which I'll set as almost like a preparation before the next session, for example. Like if we're doing a group session, I want you to go away and think about this. Giving that time to reflect in between sessions is vitally important. If I feel like they're just on the cusp, but maybe they're not quite ready, and it feels like pushing or using that frame isn't working, but I want you to go away and think about this. Like think about these specific questions, whatever questions, what I feel in the moment are useful for them to ponder in terms of what they're reflecting on. Think about it for the week. And when we come back, I'm going to pick this up. So it's almost giving them that preparation time and that acknowledgement that is coming back. I am going to come back and I'm going to be consistent in my approach to you, but I'm giving you that time to think about it. I'm not forcing it on you, but what I am saying is there is going to be a second conversation or another conversation, a follow-up conversation. I want you to think about this and reflect on it, and then we can have that conversation again. That is tends to be how I uh, assess what is useful in the space or not. If I've got multiple sessions, I tend to maybe go for the latter, because you only have a certain amount of time with young people in this spaces too. There's lots that come up, so sometimes you've got to be like, okay, that's a next week conversation. But when it is an idea that I'm like, your resistance is more rooted in the dysregulation that you feel because you feel like I'm attacking you. You equate challenge as you're not good enough. And that might be a wound that you have somewhere where challenge is registered as you're not good enough. You're not, you don't know what you're talking about. It might be seen as condemnation. I make the idea person separation as a way of remodeling maybe that interaction. For me, that's massively important with young people that have that resistance to, different ideas and perspectives or challenges. It's the idea, not the person, and modeling that in that delivery space is something that I find to be quite useful in building up their capacity for challenge. And the most beautiful thing is those interactions often result in them being able to not only be challenged, but also use that same approach with young people that they may be, in proximity to afterwards.
I think that's an effective approach. And, in my mind, I'm thinking too, this works with couples. If you're in a relationship, how many time as a man do I hear and that I've personally got dysregulated or I feel personally attacked by my wife or my female partner because I'm not separating that she's addressing an issue, not the person that I am. And same with friendships, right? Like, how many times do we get in conversations with our guy friends or what you all call mates? Like you feel that tension or that like desire to really healthily like be in conflict, but then it's either overexerted through aggression and like blowing up and yelling or hitting, or it's just avoided altogether. And I think you're offering again a third way that feels more loving and connected. And so for anyone listening, yes, this is totally primarily in the context for his work with young people, but I just want to endorse as a previous couples therapist and someone that has guy friends, like this can totally apply to other areas. So I appreciate you giving us that framework. Within these conversations, there's obviously certain topics and themes that feel more polarizing or intense. But one thing that you push back on that I really appreciate is this idea that talking about misogyny, patriarchy, these kind of buzzwords, but also really, let's say, emotionally packed phrases is too polarizing for boys, or that young men actually don't want to engage with things like mental health and talking about their feelings. But tell me, what are you seeing, not what the theory says, but what you've witnessed in the school halls and working with young boys that may tell a different story?
You're right. It's something that I speak about a lot because, again, right now, specifically in the context we're in right now, there's a range of different takes on what's happening around us. And often what I see and I hear is takes that might not be as consistently maybe involved in the context of education. There's kind of a blanket thing of, well, this too polarized and we can't bring this in when it comes to work with men and boys. But what I've noticed, and as I've mentioned earlier on, is that there is an appetite for the conversation. There is questions that want to be asked, that want to be reflected upon, that even if it's a strong opinion that might be anti, conversations relating to feminism or things like this, there is a desire to want to bring it into the space. But there's often this, can we talk about it here? Is this guy actually really wanting us to bring it in? And there's this hesitancy of like, is this, are we going to get duped right now? Like, are we going to say it? And then all of a sudden we're, getting kicked out. And it's like this sense of, can we actually talk about this in this space? And my response to that has always been, of course, because it's important that you talk about these things, these questions that you have in a way that, you know, having a conversation with your For You page or your Explore page or your algorithms isn't a conversation. It's just feeding back maybe what you think, what you believe. Conversations give you that real time. Consider it from this perspective, though. Have you heard of this person? Have you heard of it from this perspective? That for me is massively important. And what I'm seeing maybe more now than I did at the start of my career, and I think this is quite hope-inducing, at least from my perspective and my context, is that you've got more and more young men in the space that might have some resistance and hesitancy to conversations around, misogyny, sexism, violence against women and girls, but they understand why the conversation is important. They understand why maybe they the conversation is being had. They might be against it, but they can see why. Their resistance might be in the sense of, I don't believe it's me that's doing this, though, to which I often, you mentioned it earlier on as well, which we're on the same wavelength. It's like, we often equate our participation with, well, I don't hit other people, or I don't, say horrible things. It's like, yeah, but do you challenge other people when they do? Do you challenge your friends when they make the comments that for you might not be that big of a deal, but might have massive impact? Those conversations, boys are, I would say, from my lens, much more receptive to, because it's this sense of, this actually does apply to me more than I thought. And often when we get to the end of the session, some of the feedback that I get is, I came in with this idea that this is going to be a waste of my time, but this is going to be someone kind of like pointing the finger and telling me this isn't that. But now I've left, I actually understand more about these issues and these areas and these experiences. I feel like I can be one of the most beautiful questions I had from a young person at the end of a series. They came up to me and they were like, "This is really helpful. This is really useful. How can I be like safer and more welcoming to my, you know, female peers in the context of like, coming into classroom? Like, how can I be, in their words, how can I be more welcoming? How can I be more friend? How can I be safer for female peers?" And I was like, "You're asking a wonderful question, like wondering where that's coming from." And it's like, look, I'm learning about this and I'm realizing that maybe I have got some of these ideas. And I just want to be able to make sure that I'm doing my best in those spaces. Right. And I think that's beautiful. There is that appetite. And that also applies to mental health and the conversations on mental health too. Because often, I don't know about what it's positioned like, where you're positioned, but sometimes there's this idea of, well, you can only talk about misogyny or sexism or men's mental health. You can't talk about them both. And there's this idea that if I talk about violence against women and girls, misogyny, sexism, what about men's mental health? What I've noticed about boys and the work that I do is that they are much more open and aware that their identity as men is not rooted in how much they can conceal. Like when you share some of their experience, like my personal experience, like I grew up in a space culturally, not familiarly, because I was able to express at home. But in the community context that I was in, you couldn't really be hyper emotional because it might be seen as a little bit strange in that sense. So as a result of that, I started shutting down emotions in public spheres because of that reason. They were like, "I get it and I understand it, but in our friendship groups, we can be who we feel like we need to be. Like I can cry in front of my friends, or I can be really happy in front of my friends." That's really nice to hear and affirming and encouraging to hear. But there is that realness around, we want to talk about how we feel more. Like I want to be able to express, this is going on for me. I don't know where to go with this information. But there's an openness to it and a recognition of it that I'm seeing more and more over the years, which I think is hopeful, and why I believe the work that not just myself does, but other professionals in the space is so vital, is because we're providing the spaces for those ideas to be named, but also signposting them back into their school spaces for the schools to be able to continue that work moving forwards, or to other organizations in the communities to help continue that conversation. Which is why when people say it's too polarized and it's too activating, it might be activating, but those young people are, you've mentioned it earlier on as well, so much more calibrated politically, socially, than we give them credit for. They're so much more switched on. They're so much more able to have the conversations that we think they're too young for. They're there. They're able to have them. They might not get it always 100% right. They might not have the conceptual context, but they're much more aware than we give them credit for. And giving them that space for that, for me, is massively important in the work that follows.
Something that's coming up for me as you're sharing is this factor that young people deal with that I don't know roughly how old you are, but I'm going to imagine we're similar ages and older haven't, which is growing up with social media and how those not just messages imprint young men. Cause I think we've, again, with the documentaries, like I think we have focused on that part. But I think the bigger conversation and the one that I want to be having, and it seems like you're helping facilitate with them, is actually how do you discern what messages to listen to and not listen to? What voices can you trust and not trust? So I'm curious, a boy hears about these topics from, I'm going to assume, a varied amount of sources across the political spectrum, as well as like ideologically. and in different contexts. And all those are mostly subconsciously infiltrating their minds. How do you help focus on the right kind of perspectives or dialogues within those conversations, knowing that they probably have a million messages in their head, and how do you help them sort through some of those to really make sense of those concepts?
I am a bit more hands-on, a bit more practical. So I make it clear to the young people, I'm not trying to uncle you here. And I'm like, hey, when you're done here, like check your screen time on your phone. And I'm really clear. It's like I'm not trying to shame or judge. Like we're all on our phones, right? But what I want you to do once this session is done, or whether this assembly is done, whether this talk is done, I want you to check your screen time. But I want you to be really specific with your screen time. I want you to look at where you spend the most time apps wise. Is it Snapchat? Is it Instagram? Is it TikTok? But we're not just going to stop there. Where you spend the most time, I want you to go onto those apps and I want you to look at what you're watching or what shows up the most. Is that consistent? Is it the same type of messaging? Is it the same ideas, the same thought process? Because if so, going back to your screen time, if you're spending 3 hours on TikTok and you're getting the same type of message, you're hearing that message 3 hours out of your day, perhaps, right? That's a lot of time that you're hearing that message. I want you to consider where the different message might lie. Have you gone outside of what's comfortable? Have you gone outside of what you engage with? Or are you just listening to the same people because it's comfortable? How are you making time to consider different ideas and perspectives with that screen time? So you're taking something that's often pathologized or demonized like screen time and you're turning it into a learning experience. Where am I spending most of my time? Who am I watching the most? And what am I not potentially considering through hearing those ideas and perspectives so consistently? They come back in and they're like, hey, like I'm on this app for like 6 hours a day and all I'm seeing is gym content that's telling me I'm not big enough or I'm not strong enough or, you know, I'm weak if I can't hit this, or I should probably run my first stack at this age, whatever it is. I'm just like bringing some of the things that I've heard, right? And it's interesting because I never really thought about it before. I was just kind of like scrolling through. But when you actually got me to think about what I'm scrolling through, they're all very similar videos with very similar messages. And going back to that sort of imprinted thing that you was mentioning, that sense of I'm not actively engaging with the content. I'm passively consuming it and I might pick something up. Oh, that's cool. That's viral. That's whatever. But there's not an intentionality to what's being processed. And so for me, how I approach that is through that identifying what the current context is and then going, okay, you spend a lot of time in this space. For now, at this point in time, there's a lot of young people who are really interested in gym culture, personal development, and they'll often say, like some of the manfluencers or the manospheric influencers, they'll be like, "Well, I listen to this guy because he talks to me about, being the best version of yourself. Working towards being the best version of you." And I often go, there's a lot of people online that talk about this stuff that don't also talk about the other things, though, right? And it's like, wait, what do you mean? There's like, there's not just that genre of content that speaks to development. There are other people in the space that speak to that in a way that I think you'd really get along with, that aren't talking about the other stuff. Because you're saying that you're watching it because of the motivation. I don't think you're lying, but it's what you're exposed to alongside that I'm concerned about. And I want you to think about it from a different perspective. Of, are you thinking that, if that's what's important to you, self-development, becoming the best version of yourself, let's go and think about some other people that you can follow. Do some research into it and explore some of those ideas. Be a much more critical, intentional version of you when it comes to your online activity than just a passive recipient. And it's really interesting how young people kind of get on board and they kind of come up to me and they'll be like, "Hey, I checked my screen time. That was a wake up call, man. I'm on this app so much, and I need to put my phone away." And it's like what you don't name, you can't sort of acknowledge and work through. And something practical and hands on like that, something every day, gets young people to think about what they're consuming, but also how they're consuming it. And then you can kind of plant the different ideas of, well, are you considering this? Or think about it that way. What's more important to you? It creates a reflective opportunity where often passivity is kind of encouraged, for me at least.
It sounds like doing a social media inventory really helps disarm because I used to use this in couples therapy. I said when it was personal, make it practical. So if you're arguing about time management, then let's look at the schedule and let's make it practical. That way it's not a personal attack, but it's just an honest reflection. I think that's brilliant. And the second thing that I think you're getting at in there, in short, is the messages that these manfluencers are giving about the gym are actually good. Like to take responsibility, to own your life, to take care of your body, all good. I would say the meaning behind that is skewed. And that's where we teach the young men to say, hey, message, all on board with that. Like important to take care of yourself, important to develop all those things you're saying. but then introduce them to people who have a different meaning in those. Well, why do we do that? Well, so that we can show up for the people around us, not so we can gain something, but so we can give something, that kind of thing. So, and I think that changing the meaning to the messages is so brilliant. And the last question I have here is, you use this phrase mendable masculinity, which is the idea that what's built can be mended, amended, or reimagined. So for a man listening right now who's carrying something he's maybe never named or been willing to share, maybe something he inherited from his father or his culture, describe what that first act of mending actually looks like.
For me, the sort of concept came up out of recognizing myself, but also just in the young people that I work with that, we often have this cultural message in that masculinity is a completed state. Once you tick, 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 it's now completed. I think what mendable masculinity does for me and how I explain it to young people and men alike as well is, we've often positioned masculinity a little bit like a symbiote. When it catches you, it's got you and you can't get rid of it. It's that sort of thing is really difficult to sort of move out of. How I like to frame masculinity now as somebody, approaching 30 or, sort of in the third floor, as we say here in the UK, is that it's a garment. It's not a symbiote. So in the book, it's kind of like, the symbiote to sort of skin it in that sense, you can shed it. But like this idea of me, what's massively important is that I am always in control or have the ability to amend ideas or belief systems that I have, but they're not rooted to me. Like when I challenge young people's ideas, I'm challenging the idea, not the person. It's because I recognize that idea doesn't need to be like figuratively or, nailed to you. It's not something you carry for life. I'm not the same masculinity that I was age 18, approaching, being 28 right now. Things have changed, things have evolved, things have moved forwards. And what mendable masculinity does, and approaching mendable masculinity as a way of like framing masculinity says, I'm not trying to be a type, this type of masculinity, ABC, this type of masculinity, EDF kind of thing, right? It's like this idea of like, I'm trying to be constantly collaborative and creative of how I present myself. Sometimes I feel like I might, this idea of masculinity that I have right now isn't serving me in this space. These ideas and belief systems that I have, I can change those. They're not rooted to me. They're not something that I'm sort of bound to for life. It's something that I can inspect, examine, and bring about. It's something that's really challenging for a lot of men, particularly I say older masculinity, like in and around sort of like maybe even men in and around my age, where it's like, well, I've been this type of masculinity for 10, 15 years. It's hard for me to change, of course, because that narrative and that change, sort of belief system is that this is who I need to be. But who are you being? Is it for you or is it for somebody else? And is the version that you're projecting for other people more than it is yourself? Are you, I call this in the book, duality strain? Are you kind of being the person that you're expected to be or the person you actually are? So what mendable masculinity allows us to do is take inventory of that. I feel like I can work on this, but I also recognize I'm a constant work in progress, and that is okay. Perfection and this idea of becoming the perfect man of masculinity is what, in my opinion, traps a lot of men into either not engaging in ideas of development and betterment or standing 10 toes down on this is the particular way. There is a fear of being told you can improve and be better, or this is something we need to work on because we equate that with challenge. I'm very open with how I approach this and go, I'm working on several things in myself right now in this space at all times. And I'm not ashamed about that. I'm not hiding away from that. It's something that I name and I sort of vocalize with intention. And being able to talk about that, working through that process of mending and amending, not from a position of this is evidence of inadequacy, but this is an opportunity for me to improve and continue to be better across all facets of life. That's kind of how I approach it. And how I don't explain like that to the young people I work with because they'd be like, hey man, what is this? What's going on? But it's like this sense of constantly being able to amend or attune to what you need and not being afraid to change aspects of who you are and inspect the soil of your garden, for lack of a better term. What works for young people, because we're in a gaming culture right now, masculinity or mendable masculinity is a little bit like your avatar, whether it's Fortnite, GTA Online, if you're old enough to play that, like how you spend time creating those characters and making sure that they fit, and you might change it after a while because new skins unlocked. You want to make that person look cool. Masculinity is like that. It's fluid. It's plural. We can change that presentation. We're not bound to the sort of lessons of our predecessors. We are constantly creative. Human beings are creative, curative beings. Like we can curate and create together. that's kind of how I like to approach masculinity in my work. Less about types, more about that process of creating and when necessary, holding ourselves to account and taking things away when necessary. That's how I approach it.
Yeah, and I think what you're getting at, we know statistically that the number one trait that causes the most issues related to men, so substance abuse, suicide, incarceration rates, all those that we know to be drastically dominated by males, comes down to the trait of being too rigid. And I think what you're getting at, and while that mostly applies to the older range of young men to middle age, it certainly applies to young men as well. And I think it frees up guys to be where they're at, but not hold too tightly to that. And I really appreciate that you named the more modern understanding of this developmental arc essentially through the lens of gaming, because I think that is something that is totally made up in a sense, but it's made up based in reality. So it's saying, like, if you were an avatar and you were to see life as an adventure and you were to see life as you could create the best version of yourself, and there's actually no limits to that. We only talk about how there's no limits to the evil young men can do and all those things. What if we introduce what look at the positive impact? What if you said you could spend your entire life becoming the man that you want to be? And along the way, what if you made everyone else around you better and this world better? What would that look like? And letting them kind of fill in the story and write it and then believe it and then live it. I think that's what you're getting at. I think if we can help young men be empowered to believe like, hey, you matter. Like you're here on earth, but it's not just to be self-sabotaging or self-serving or even self-sacrificing. It's actually meant to be self-generative, where you're able to give who you are as a person to the world and whatever that looks like. And if you were to imagine what that looks like in a way that feels true to you, but also rooted in reality in a way that's helpful to others, what would that look like? And I imagine your work is doing that. So I'm really thankful for all the wisdom you shared.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I love that frame at the end. I think it's a great way of introducing some of these topics into young people and people alike. So thank you. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Well, tell us, Lewis, where we can find your work and what you're up to.
You can find my work across my social media platforms. So it's just at Lewis Wedlock across most social media platforms. At the minute, I am still very much rooted in the school based work. And so a lot of my work is still focusing on sort of like plurality of masculinity. I do a lot of engagements across a range of different schools, but I'm really sort of helping, hopefully, in a space to think about ways in which we engage masculinities, but not just monolithically, where it's like, oh, we're just working with men and boys, but how those ideas impact wider culture is in microcosm of school, but also how that applies to culture as well. So I'm still in those spaces. I'm still contributing in those areas and helping other organizations and people to kind of, get involved in this work as well and demystifying a lot of the, ideas of what this work should or could look like and sort of providing the basis of how this can look from a position of attunement, care, compassion, and rooting it in the real, as you said. So that's kind of what I'm up to. And just continually promoting the book and all this type of stuff. But on the ground with young people, meeting them where they're at and helping them to explore their own magnificence in the world around them. That's kind of what I'm up to.
Well said. And I appreciate how the focus was on the message that you're bringing, not the products that come from that. Though, I think that what you're offering is invaluable. And so we'll make sure to put all that in the show notes for anyone who's
Appreciate that.
desiring to check it out. And yeah, thank you again for sharing all your wisdom and for the work you're doing for the good of men.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. All the best now. Thank you.